"Where you headed, old man?" "Just standing there at the corner, like some sneaky old fool." "Just standing there at the corner, like some sneaky old fool." In the stillness of a windless afternoon, a black elder collapsed on the sidewalk. His only offense was waiting quietly for his son, and just a few seconds later that son appeared. They thought he was just another poor, harmless old man. They were wrong. He was the father of a Delta Force operator. Where you live. Do stories like this happen often? What state are you in? Watch until the end to see what happens when justice doesn't get called. It walks in on its own. Mr. Ezekiel Rowe stood quietly under the short awning of a small corner grocery store, his right hand holding a paper bag filled with a few simple items for dinner, his left resting lightly on a worn wooden cane. The sun was about to sink behind a row of aging buildings, casting his shadow long across the cracked cement sidewalk. In the bag were a loaf of white bread, 2 golden apples, a packet of instant porridge, and a bottle of cold medicine. The kind he always bought for Walter, even though he knew his son never got sick. But it had become a habit, just like waiting at this exact spot, at this exact hour, every time his son left base to come home for dinner with his father. A soft vibration on his wrist made him glance down. The old digital watch buzzed to signal 5:30 in the afternoon, the same time as always. No one had programmed it but him, and no one needed the reminder but Walter. No matter how far he went, no matter how busy he was, that Delta Force soldier always knew his father was standing right here, like a second hand that never missed a beat. Ezekiel raised a hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead, then exhaled softly, as if trying to shake off the nameless weight pressing into his chest. He hadn't been young enough to ride a bike for some time, but this neighborhood still made him feel safe, at least until today. A few people passed by and greeted him with familiar glances. Some smiled, some nodded. In their eyes, Ezekiel was neither someone special nor someone forgettable. He was part of the block, like the old tree stump outside the barber shop or the chipped street sign at the corner. A breeze tugged gently at the paper bag, revealing the tip of the bread loaf. He adjusted the bag, then leaned forward a step to brace himself against the wooden pillar beside him. His legs ached dully with every shift in the weather, a lingering cost of years in the military, of long night shifts at the field hospital where he once worked as a medic. That was where he learned how to keep someone alive, sometimes with nothing more than a look, and also where he learned its cruel opposite, the helplessness of being ignored because of the color of your skin. But he never told Walter those stories. That father always chose to talk about sneaking cornbread from the kitchen during night duty, or about the time he was mistaken for the chief physician just because he knew how to wrap a bandage properly. He was proud of his son, not because Walter wore a uniform or carried a badge, but because after everything, he still called him Dad, drove him to the market on Sundays, bought the exact brand of mouthwash he liked, even though he never used it himself. Ezekiel once said, if anything made a man a soldier, it wasn't how he handled a weapon, it was how he cared for someone weaker than himself. Walter understood that, and that's why, this evening, he would come. The car hadn't arrived yet, but he knew his son was on the way. The rhythm of passing traffic didn't make him turn his head. He believed in punctuality the way he believed in his heartbeat. His grip tightened on the bag handle as 2 patrol cars passed by the end of the street, then circled back. Nothing unusual. The police often patrolled this area, especially around rush hour. But this time, they didn't drive on. They stopped, and for a brief moment he saw a look that felt unfamiliar, lacking courtesy, devoid of anything good. But that came later, for now Mr. Ezekiel still stood waiting, under the blood-red sunlight, holding a bag of groceries, quietly assured that Walter would arrive, just like always. An old woman, walking her small dog, pulled her coat tighter as she passed by Mr. Ezekiel. She gave a gentle smile, a slight nod, just enough to count as a greeting, an instinct born of years living among familiar neighbors. He responded with a soft glance, a small tilt of the head, and a tight-lipped smile. His eyes still carried the gentleness of someone who had once worked in caregiving, even though his hands now trembled and his voice had grown faint. That nod wasn't just politeness. It came from knowing the worth of quiet gestures. At that age, people don't need long conversations. They don't expect them either. A look is enough to remind each other we've made it through another day. After that exchange, he turned to look down the street. The rooftops covered in dark tin sheets, the old iron doors tagged with faded silver spray paint, and farther down the familiar curve in the road where Walter always first appeared, driving his charcoal SUV. Every Friday afternoon his son would honk twice, short and sharp, not to rush him, but to say, "Dad, I'm home." Mr. Ezekiel took a deep breath, as if borrowing a bit of wind to warm his chest. Autumn had arrived earlier this year, or maybe his bones were weakening faster. He wasn't sure anymore. The breeze slipped beneath his shirt collar, making him shiver slightly. But he didn't go inside the shop. He hated closing the door behind him while his son hadn't arrived yet. He always told himself, if you're waiting, you stand there until what you believe in shows up. It might sound stubborn, but for Ezekiel, that logic had kept him going ever since his wife passed away. He mumbled to himself, just loud enough to hear, "Hurry up, son. It's cold." His voice seemed aimed at the wind or the emptiness ahead. It was hoarse, but not sad, perhaps because he believed Walter would come, as he always did. Since Walter's mother had died of kidney failure, the two had lived together in a slow, patient rhythm. People asked why he didn't move into a nursing home. He answered, "I live where I'm still being waited for, not where they guess how soon I'll die." He had said that in front of Walter once, not to make him feel guilty, but so his son would understand. Someone's presence in your life shouldn't be measured by obligation, but by the quiet repetition of trust. A gust of wind lifted the edge of the paper bag, the scent of green apples mixed with the smell of damp paper and dry wood. He felt a twinge of hunger, but didn't eat. He always waited to eat with his son. Just then, the sound of an engine echoed from afar. A sedan sped through the intersection without slowing down, making him instinctively take a small step back. But it wasn't Walter. He returned to his spot, tapping his cane gently to keep balance. His legs were going numb, but he didn't complain. His other hand gripped the bag's handle like holding on to a final breath he hadn't let go of yet. A patrol car slowed as it approached the curb. He didn't get a clear look at the driver. He only saw the side window roll down. Inside were two white men in police uniforms, leaning back, like they had just finished their shift or were looking to kill time. Both stared at him like he was a clearance item left behind after a sale. Mr. Ezekiel remained still, unmoving, showing no expression that could be misread. He had learned through experience that a black man standing on the street would always be misread, even when doing nothing. But he had also learned that avoiding attention never kept anyone alive longer. Many times during his army service, he had stood in bombed-out hospital wings, still lifting IV bags, not because he wasn't afraid, but because someone in front of him needed more time to live. His gaze passed over the two officers, not confrontational, but not bowed either, not because he had something to prove. At his age, raising or lowering his head had little to do with pride. It was about truth, and the truth at that moment was this: he was still standing there, waiting for Walter, in a society growing more skilled at justifying wrongdoing. The patrol car didn't leave. Its engine kept running. The passenger lit a cigarette while the driver squinted like he was about to start something Mr. Ezekiel neither needed nor wanted, but his eyes didn't waver. Mr. Ezekiel stayed put, not to challenge anyone, but because Walter hadn't arrived yet. And the evening, cold as it was, wasn't over. The patrol car remained parked by the curb, engine humming steadily like the breath of someone who had just woken from a nap, vision still blurry but ready to cause trouble if given the excuse. Inside, two uniformed officers in navy shirts sat with misaligned buttons, loosely fastened radio straps, and the stench of alcohol soaked into the seats. Neither wore outer jackets, though the wind had picked up, and the looks they exchanged held more boredom than vigilance. The one in the passenger seat leaned his head against the window, bloodshot eyes drifting lazily until they landed on Ezekiel, standing motionless in front of the grocery store. He squinted, tugged at the corner of his mouth, voice raspy from cigarettes. "Doesn't that guy look like the mug shot from that old warrant?" His voice wasn't low. It rang out just loud enough for people outside to hear, like a mock slap on the back in a crowded market. Both arrogant and pathetic. The driver scoffed, glanced over, and nodded with a lazy smirk. Yeah, white hair like that, standing right at the corner, looks just like some old bastard hiding from something. They didn't need to check any suspect list or even look closely at his face. They just needed an excuse, a slight resemblance, a bit of irritation, a lingering trace of cheap liquor from the rest stop, and in front of them, Ezekiel Rowe was enough to satisfy all three at once. They opened the doors. A sharp screech sliced into the cooling air. Thick-soled boots hit the sidewalk with quick, pressing thuds, as if each step toward Ezekiel was loaded with judgment. He did not step back, nor did he advance. He simply stood still, gripping his cane and grocery bag. His arms stayed steady. His gaze shifted once, from one officer's face to the other, slow, clear, fully aware of what was coming. The taller officer stepped forward, hand resting on his gun belt. The shorter one leaned in, elbow on his knee, like observing a strange object in a lab. "Where you headed, old man?" he asked, flecks of tobacco clinging to the edge of his lips. "What are you doing just standing here?" Ezekiel inhaled deeply, his voice calm to the point of unsettling. "I'm waiting for my son. He's on his way home." He did not raise his voice, did not apologize, and showed no fear. But that calmness, in their eyes, was offensive. They wanted to scramble, shaking hands, searching for ID, eyes looking down. Ezekiel gave them none of that. The second officer frowned, glanced at his partner, then barked, "Name, are you carrying ID?" He stepped in closer, his knee nearly touching Ezekiel's cane. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He spoke slowly, each word shaped with deliberate care. "My name is Ezekiel Rowe, former Army medic, retired. I stand here every day. Ask anyone on this block." The answer thickened the air. The taller officer exhaled through his nose, shook his head, and pulled out his phone. He tapped a few buttons in a half-hearted search while his eyes remained locked on Ezekiel's collar. His actions weren't aimed at verification. They were like picking at flaws on someone already deemed wrong. No matching records, he knew that before he even checked. But he still said, old guys who served in the military tend to think they're untouchable. But this is my street. The other officer chuckled hoarsely, turned toward the car as if waiting for a signal from the radio. No signal came, but the silence stretching for those few seconds was enough for Ezekiel to realize this was no longer about identification. This was about a man who had outlived society's patience, and men who had grown too used to using power to satisfy something that never had a name. "You can't stand here," the officer said. "This area is under surveillance. There's a report of a black suspect hiding around here." Mr. Ezekiel lifted the corner of his mouth ever so slightly, as if hearing an old story told for the 10th time in the same tired tone. "Then the report is wrong. I'm not the man you're looking for." His eyes didn't leave the officer's. His words weren't mocking or defiant. They were clear, like a crumpled ID card smoothed out flat. The second officer clenched his fists, moved in closer, and still, Walter had not arrived. The city ticked on in its rhythm, second by second, and only Ezekiel's old watch failed to sound a warning of what was coming. Their boots hit the ground hard, not in unison but with a pressure that suppressed everything around them. The taller one raised a hand, pointed it straight at Ezekiel's face, and snapped, "Hands up!" The command pierced the silence, drawing a few glances from across the street, none of which lasted more than 3 seconds before drifting away. In a place where being questioned for one's skin color was more habit than exception, police presence no longer surprised anyone. Sometimes it even made people turn away faster. Ezekiel stood firm, eyes unblinking, still holding his cane in his bag. He looked at them both as if waiting for them to remember who he was, or at the very least to realize he wasn't the man they thought he was. "You're drunk," he said. His voice was low and hoarse, carrying the weariness of years spent speaking to people who never really paused to listen. "I'm waiting for my son, not for trouble." The statement wasn't a challenge, nor was it submissive. It was simply the truth, and that was precisely what unsettled the two officers in that first moment, not because they felt guilty, but because his answer didn't match the script they were too familiar with. The one on the left squinted, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to confirm whether that posture wasn't just a disguise. He had learned to sniff out resistance through body language alone, but with Ezekiel, everything was still. No trembling, no excess motion. His silence was like a dull but deep blade, slicing through the thick crust of accusations that had been repeated so often they lost their meaning. "I said, hands up," the taller one repeated, louder this time. Something in Ezekiel's eyes was starting to itch at his instincts. Maybe it was indifference, maybe clarity. Whatever it was, it bothered him. Ezekiel didn't move, his gaze locked with the man's. "I've stood here all week. My son picks me up at this time every day. Ask anyone inside that shop." The man on the right chuckled dryly, spat on the edge of the curb, then pulled his radio from his shoulder. "I don't need to ask anyone. I saw you loitering. What are you doing, standing here all week?" His hand slid the safety off his holster, almost as a reflex. It wasn't defense. It was the kind of gesture meant to remind the person in front that they were being pulled into a lower place. No shouting, no violence, just one finger ready on the trigger. Ezekiel exhaled slowly, offering no reply. He shifted his foot slightly to the left, not in defense, but to regain balance. His knee hurt, and the cold made his joints throb, but he knew even a single step back would shift everything. The smallest concession would become their proof to act, and he didn't want to give them any proof at all. "Last warning," said the officer, his voice sharp now, like a knife slapped against a cutting board for the third time. "I won't repeat myself." "I didn't ask you to," Ezekiel replied, his voice like stone scraped by wind. "I'm standing here, exactly here. If you need paperwork, I can give it to you. If you need to shoot someone, then there's nothing more I can help with." That sentence cracked the air like a surge of underground current. The taller officer stepped forward. His brief nod to his partner was the only cue needed to shift the scene. In the fading light of late afternoon, the shadows of the three stretched across the street, merging as if each of them were an unfinished ending in a breaking news story. The smell of cigarettes, rubber, damp concrete, and blood nearly met in the middle. But in Ezekiel's eyes, the one thing left, burning and still, was faith. Faith that his son was still on his way. The officer leaned forward, gripping his belt as if his hand needed something to hold on to, something to restrain the last bit of patience slipping out of him. His eyes were bloodshot, not from the wind, but from heat, the kind born from pride denied, from seeing someone refuse to bow to his command. He ground each word through clenched teeth, as if threatening was a muscle memory trained into his bloodstream. "I won't say it again. Either you get in the car, or you get in a body bag." His voice struck Ezekiel's chest like a stone dropped onto frozen water. The old man stepped back once, not out of fear, but to keep a distance from becoming the next insult. His cane shifted slightly, the tip of his shoe brushing the thin dust across the sidewalk. He looked directly at the officer, as if reading every wrinkle on that smug face, then spoke slowly, his tone level and firm. "I saved lives in a war. What about you?" The air stopped. Ezekiel's words weren't hard, but their roots were like sharpened rock lodged deep into the earth. The officer didn't answer right away, because in that brief moment, the unconscious comparison between himself and the man in front of him made his hand hesitate. No one talks about war like a scar to boast about, but Ezekiel had said it like a declaration of dignity. The other officer clicked his tongue, spat out a curse, then yanked the radio off his shoulder. He mumbled a few vague phrases about a non-compliant subject, suspicious evasion, and emergency response, all phrased just ambiguously enough to avoid accountability under review. The device's static blended with passing cars, a distant horn from another street, and the fading footsteps of those who knew that staying might mean seeing something they wouldn't forget. Ezekiel lowered his cane to the ground, not to lean on it, but to plant it upright like a flagpole in the middle of the street. His shadow stretched long, cutting across the faded bricks, past both pairs of police boots. He no longer moved, his gaze for the men in front of him. It began to reach farther, toward where his son still had not arrived. I once held my hand over the chest of a bleeding soldier without asking what color his skin was, he continued, not allowing the silence to be filled with hostility. I've been threatened with enemy guns, but never with the gun of my own, and now I stand here, targeted by someone who wears the same flag I do. That sentence thickened the air around them. The officer snarled and stepped closer, his boot landing on the edge of Ezekiel's sagging paper bag. One of the apples rolled out, hit the ground, and split open. Its red skin burst, its flesh crushed, apple juice trailing into a narrow streak across the curb. No one bent down. The only thing still moving was the officer's hand near his gun, and Ezekiel's eyes never left it. "I don't want trouble with you," the officer hissed through his teeth, "but I'll make it if I have to." Ezekiel gave a small nod as one who had long anticipated the answer. "The problem is," he said, "you always think trouble comes from the ones who don't obey, but real trouble comes from not listening to what's right." In the middle of that sentence, a car horn echoed from afar. A familiar two-note sound rang from the far end of the street. It wasn't the police. It was Walter. But in that moment, the officer drew his gun. The action no longer belonged to reason, but to an instinct numbed by the laziness of unchecked authority. The jerk of his arm was fast and heavy, as if the gun were an anchor to his unspoken rage. A sharp "damn it" burst from his throat, unclear if from panic, regret, or something deeper, trapped beneath a temper never taught to pause. And then the shot rang out. The gunshot wasn't loud, but it sliced the soundscape like a blade. Birds scattered from the power lines. A car in the distance slammed its brakes, horn blaring, before going silent. The air froze like a pane of glass, cracking in the middle of winter. The paper bag in Mr. Ezekiel's hand fell first. The handle slipped from fingers that had lost their grip. The remaining apple rolled out, hit the stone pavement, and cracked in half. 3 eggs collided before hitting the ground, making a heavy, shattering sound. Not enough to frighten, but enough to choke anyone who had ever cooked a dinner. Red blood spilled out, sticking to the thin layer of dust on the sidewalk, blending into the dark red patch that began spreading beneath Mr. Ezekiel's shirt. His body shifted slightly, knees giving out first, like a man trying to regain balance after a wave of dizziness. But there was no balance left to find. Blood seeped through the fabric, from the back of his shirt to his waistband, then trickled along the folds of the fabric. The white cloth was cut by a spreading red streak that reached the hem of his shirt where the pocket of his trousers had already darkened. He toppled forward like someone sitting down in a market, about to ask the price, only to realize his wallet was gone. His gaze wasn't aimed at the officer who had fired, but at a corner down the block. There, headlights from a gray SUV had just come around the bend, slowing at the sight of the frozen crowd. Walter had arrived. But Mr. Ezekiel had no words left to say. Walter slammed the brakes. The tires screeched across the pavement, the SUV jerking slightly to the side. The door flung open before the wheels had fully stopped. He jumped out, his uniform still covered in sand from the training base. One hand tore the cap from his head, eyes sweeping quickly toward the unmoving crowd. He rushed forward, past confused glances, past hands that almost pulled out phones but then stuffed them back into pocket. His long, determined strides carried an urgency that needed no alarm. Then he saw Mr. Ezekiel lying sideways on the cold stone, his hand near the cane, the torn paper bag beside him. Blood had soaked the back of his white shirt, spreading in a line from shoulder to hip, crawling down the sidewalk like an accusation that needed no words. Walter dropped to his knees, cradling his father, the blood soaking into his tactical gear, still dusty from the field. He yanked off his gloves, which fell beside a broken egg, its yolk smeared across the Delta logo near his wrist. The officer stepped back, gun still raised, eyes locked on the collapsing figure. He mumbled something, but no one heard. The street was silent. Everything had stopped. Walter didn't look at him, didn't ask anyone anything. He held his father, feeling each slowing heartbeat in his hands, each broken, blood-stained breath. A sharp gasp came from Mr. Ezekiel's throat, then faded. His shoulders slumped, his head tilted, resting fully against his son's chest. Walter held tighter, blood now smearing his forearm and seeping into his sleeve. No one moved. The distant stares didn't know whether to run forward or turn away. The other officer hadn't yet grasped what had happened, his eyes darting, hand reaching for his radio, but the first words he spoke weren't to request medical help, they were a defense. The suspect was non-compliant, warned 3 times, there are witnesses, there's a camera. Walter heard it. He didn't look up, but every muscle in his body drew taut like a steel wire pulled to its limit. His hand touched his father's forehead, wiped the thin, blood-streaked dust, then placed it gently on his father's shoulder, as if returning him to the form he had always known, resilient, kind, and now powerless. In that moment, he knew nothing else needed to be said, and he also knew the men in front of him had just placed themselves in the hands of someone who would not back down, not for blood, not for pride, not for the death of a man who had once saved lives without asking names. Walter's eyes locked on the blood. The first feeling wasn't pain. It was a confusion. He didn't understand right away. For a few short seconds, his mind strained to find another explanation for the scene before him. Maybe someone had fallen. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe anything but what he feared. But the blood was real. That red color, that metallic smell, the strange angle of his father's body, all of it erased the hope his brain had tried to invent. He dropped to his knees, cradling Mr. Ezekiel's body as if holding something that must not break. His chest tightened as his hands touched the wound where the blood was already cooling. The scent of cigarettes, street dust, and blood merged into something sickening. Walter looked down at his hands, then at the right shoulder of his uniform, where a small American flag was stitched. A red stain from his father's blood had soaked into that very spot, spreading and sticking. He inhaled hard, trying to hold back the sound rising in his throat, but still let out a hoarse cry. Not loud or long, but heavy like the crack of breaking bone. He lowered his head close to his father's ear and said his name, just once. Then he pressed his forehead to the forehead of the man who had once held him through fevers, who had lifted him after he first crashed during driving lessons, who had sat with him the night before he enlisted. There was no reply, no breath. His father's body was turning cold. Walter placed his hand on his chest, where he had once been told an old wartime bullet remained, one that the doctors had never removed. It might still be there now, but it had been joined by a newer hole, colder, more modern, and fired by someone who claimed to serve justice. Walter looked up and around. Bystanders still stood nearby. A few stepped back. A few raised phones, then lowered them again. The 2 officers were still there. The one who had fired kept the gun lowered but not holstered, blinking rapidly as if he hadn't decided how to feel yet. Walter stared at him. Not blinking, not speaking, not stepping forward, just staring. That look held no loud rage and asked for no reason. It was simple, like an open wound meant to bleed, meant to be seen without need for explanation. The wind blew through, carrying bits of paper and the scent of dinner from a nearby shop. Everything felt normal to the point of cruelty, and within that backdrop of normalcy, a father had died, a son had fallen to his knees, and no one had spoken of justice. Walter lowered his head again, his hand gripping his father's hand, feeling the veins that had once held the pulses of so many now fading. He didn't cry, not out of strength, but from something deeper than tears, a clearer awareness that any drop falling now would be swallowed by the dust like all apologies that came too late. And it was too late to save his father, but not too late to return the truth to everything that had just been denied with the pull of a trigger. The officer stepped back, foot slipping slightly on the cement as Walter's stare cut through him. The gun hand, once firm, began to tremble. No one grabbed the weapon, but it drooped on its own like the crumbling faith he had clung to now peeling away in layers. He opened his mouth, voice cracking in confusion. I didn't, but the unfinished sentence found no ears waiting to hear the rest. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer held value in what had just occurred. Walter remained by Mr. Ezekiel's body, his cheek pressed to his father's forehead, trying to hold on to the last warmth as it left this world. His hand on the shoulder, feeling the blood slow beneath aging skin. In that moment, the soldier who had crossed war zones, who had faced death countless times, sat still like a son who had just lost the only home he ever had. That silence didn't bring relief. It only made the air heavier. The other officer took half a step forward, then stopped when he noticed a few civilians nearby shifting their gaze toward him. No one shouted, but the way people clenched their fists, the way a few stepped back but kept looking, that was pressure enough. Walter leaned in gently, his lips close to Mr. Ezekiel's ear. He whispered just loud enough for himself to hear, but not to be drowned out by traffic or wind. He spoke 3 words, each one nailed into the ground like a stake. Do not forgive. It was not a command nor a plea. It was a declaration, a message not meant for the dead, but for whatever was still alive inside him. Forgiveness had always been his first instinct when witnessing cruelty, but not this time. Every ounce of patience, every layer of reason built over years of training, each moral code sharpened by military discipline, now stood silent before the blood of his kin spilled beneath the flag sewn to his sleeve. Walter did not need a reason. He was not looking to justify the fury rising in his chest. The only thing he knew for certain was that no forgiveness belonged in this moment. The officer jerked his hand from the trigger as if he had touched a needle. He turned to his partner, searching for an excuse, but met only a long silence. Neither of them spoke again. The hand that once held the gun now hung loosely, his knees slightly bent, as if buckling under a reality he could no longer control. A woman from a distance stepped forward a few paces, holding her phone but not recording. She stood still, hand over her chest, eyes glistening as though she had just seen something she had waited too long to witness. The truth, exposed without needing explanation. Walter did not move. His shoulders trembled slightly, but no sound came out. A few old newspaper pages swept down the sidewalk, carried by the wind, brushing past Mr. Ezekiel's body like a makeshift burial in the middle of the city. The street had no engine sounds now, no hurried footsteps, only a father left behind, a son holding tight, and those around them realizing they were witnessing a moment not easily repeated, a moment when a man refused forgiveness, not to sow hatred, but to remind that some deaths must be remembered with clarity, not mercy, that some bullets cannot be taken back, just as some wounds will never heal if people keep forgiving what should never be allowed again. The security camera mounted above the grocery store wall, seemingly useless for months, suddenly became the only witness that could not lie. The angle was off, the footage slightly tilted, but the entire scene was captured within the frame. From the moment Mr. Ezekiel stepped back to the officer pulling the trigger, and finally to Walter rushing in to hold his father, everything was recorded without missing a second. In that video, no one spoke more than 3 sentences. There was no fight, no physical resistance, and no sign of threat from the elderly man who was holding a bag of groceries. Everything was clear enough that no viewer could cling to any excuse. Mr. Ezekiel stood, then fell. The officer stepped back. Walter appeared, his eyes landing on the exact spot where the bullet had struck. The camera caught that gaze, a look that felt less like a son's and more like a living indictment. The clip was uploaded less than 30 minutes after the incident. No one knew who posted it first, but the footage crossed the 1 million view mark in under 2 hours. The silence between each line of dialogue only emphasized the rhythm of tragedy. The way Mr. Ezekiel leaned to the side, the way Walter held his father without saying a word, the way the officer trembled, stammering unfinished words. All of it formed a sequence of images that left people breathless, without the need for sound. The media jumped in. Major outlets ran headlines from different angles. Some labeled it a procedural accident. Others wrote plainly murder driven by bias. Behavioral analysts appeared non-stop on news segments, decoding Walter's facial expressions, speculating on the shift in his gaze and the tightening of his fist. But the real storm didn't come from the experts. It came from the comments of everyday viewers. thousands writing the same sentence. I don't need to hear anything else. I've seen enough. The hashtag, "he was just waiting," first appeared in a personal post, then spread across multiple platforms. People who had once been stopped in the street, questioned for walking alone at night, began sharing their own stories. A still image cut from the footage went viral. Walter holding his father, blood from Mr. Ezekiel's shirt staining his uniform sleeve. The image needed no caption, but wherever it appeared, people left the same symbols: a flame and a clenched fist. Not long after, an independent news site published a full, accurate transcript of the video dialogue. "Hands up. I saved lives in a war. Either you get in the car or you get in a body bag." Those cold black and white lines printed on paper sent more chills than the original footage. Local authorities were forced to announce an investigation. The head of the police department requested leave for personal reasons 3 hours after the video hit 10 million views. A city council member called for an emergency meeting to prevent unrest, but the clearest message didn't come from any official statement or apology. It came from a feeling spreading through the community that this wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last if people kept turning away. In a second video, recorded from a third-floor window by a nearby resident, Walter can be seen placing his father's hand gently onto the pavement, then standing up and walking step by step toward the officer, whose hand was still trembling around his weapon. The clip ends at the exact moment their eyes meet again. No one knows what happened immediately after that, but thousands stopped at that image and wrote the same thing. "We just lost a father. Let's not lose the son, too." The hashtag "he was just waiting" first appeared quietly beneath a video clip with no clear source. Just a few simple words, no exclamation marks, no excessive capitalization, but enough for thousands of others to find it and immediately agree. No campaign was necessary, nor were any calls to action needed. That hashtag became the final piece that named the story just witnessed. Mr. Ezekiel was not fleeing. He was simply standing there, waiting for the son he had always believed would come. From that moment, an undercurrent began to spread across platforms. A screenshot of Walter's eyes, captured the exact moment he turned to look at the one who pulled the trigger, was shared over and over. The camera angle was grainy, but that gaze taken from the original clip was cropped, brightened, and spread like a symbol. A verified account commented, "I've watched it 6 times and still can't believe it. Those eyes don't belong to an ordinary man." Below were hundreds of reactions, angry faces, crying emojis, or just a fist clenched tight. That commenter was not famous for journalism or media, but for having once served as a Navy corpsman. Perhaps that was why his words weren't dismissed as emotional. People began analyzing Walter's eyes the way they once dissected cultural icons. Some called it the gaze of someone who had just lost his roots. Others said it was the look only a warrior who had lost a comrade would have. Still others believed it held the weight of an entire generation, unable to forgive the wrongs repeated under blue uniform. Psychologists joined in. A behavioral expert took a still from the footage, added a facial emotion map, and wrote, "This is a look no longer aimed at an individual. It sees through the person in front into a system, unseen but persistent. It is a gaze that refuses to forget." Amid that rising tide, he was just waiting, morphed into several other forms. Waited too long, justice is late, not another name. Each hashtag carried a fury not released through chants or fists, but through memory and acknowledgement. People began telling their own stories. A woman wrote about her father, beaten outside his home just for smoking after 10 p.m. A young boy posted a photo of his grandfather sitting alone on a park bench with the caption, "He wasn't shot, but he was afraid to step outside." On another video platform, a user recreated the entire scene into a short film of just 4 shots. Mr. Ezekiel waiting, 2 officers approaching, Walter running, and that gaze. No dialogue added, no background music. The video lasted under a minute but reached nearly 3 million views in 2 days. The caption read only, "It's not death that haunts us. It's the moment we know we couldn't stop it." The story reached high schools, colleges, and community gatherings. Anywhere someone had ever felt dismissed because of their skin color, age, or appearance that didn't suit someone in uniform, there they saw a part of Mr. Ezekiel. But what was strange was that, even as the pain was shared, the focus wasn't placed on hatred. It centered on the waiting for a son, waiting to go home, waiting for the dinner that had been prepared. And because of that, Mr. Ezekiel's death surpassed the shelf life of a headline. It became a lingering question in the hearts of every viewer. If that were my father, would I have made it in time? And if I had, would I forgive? No one answered that question with words. They answered it with a look, just like Walter did. The press conference was hastily arranged in a small conference room inside NYPD headquarters. Behind the podium stood a backdrop printed with the department's logo, and on the table lay printed statements, stamped with the words, "Content approved." A middle-aged spokesperson with a tired face read each sentence slowly, as if every word had been revised 10 times. He spoke of an unfortunate incident, emphasized that the use of force was not intentional, and that the victim failed to comply with the officer's clear commands. The final line ended with a robotic expression of condolences, sounding as if it had been generated by an algorithm. No one in the room stood up in protest, but no one clapped. Reporters exchanged glances, some scribbled notes, some took photos without bothering to adjust focus. News outlets published the statements almost immediately, but the summaries from the press conference were quickly criticized as hollow, shallow, and evasive. What drew the public's attention wasn't in the scripted remarks, but in the absence of the one person they hoped to hear from, Walter Rowe. Walter had been invited to speak several times. Media outlets, independent journalists, and even a representative from the governor's office requested a word, even the briefest sentence. But all received the same reply: "I have nothing to say to the media. I have work to do." And that work did not involve giving interviews. Exactly one day after the press conference, Walter submitted a petition to the Federal Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation, beyond the jurisdiction of the NYPD, free from influence by any state-level law enforcement agency. The file was sent in a thick envelope containing a detailed written report of the entire event, evidence gathered from eyewitnesses, a copy of the surveillance camera footage, and a list of similar past cases that had been either buried or handled internally. Walter did not sign it with a title or military rank. On the cover page, he wrote a single sentence: "I am the son of Mr. Ezekiel Rowe, and I want to know why my father had to die." The petition quickly spread among lawyers and civil rights organizations. They saw in it not only a demand for personal justice, but a warning to the entire system that silence would no longer be tolerated. A former federal prosecutor called it a case written in blood, but argued with reason. Legal experts began analyzing each detail in the file, assessing that the likelihood of the Justice Department being compelled to intervene was high, especially given that public trust in city law enforcement was at a historic low. Meanwhile, Walter continued his daily routine. He did not avoid public places, did not seek shelter. He remained the same tall man in an old brown coat, still visited the grocery store where his father once stood, and still paused when someone greeted him. But his eyes had changed. They were no longer the quiet eyes of a man who had served silently in uniform. They were the eyes of someone who knew exactly what kind of war he was now walking into, one without trenches. An old friend from his unit once messaged him, "You don't have to carry this alone." Walter replied with just one sentence, "I'm not carrying it. I'm laying back every stone they once tried to bury." City officials began to feel the pressure radiating from outside. When the investigation file reached a well-known state legislator, known for reforming law enforcement, the issue was no longer internal, and Walter's refusal to speak turned out to be the loudest statement of all. No cooperation with excuses, no acceptance of narratives rewritten by power. He wasn't demanding justice for a victim, he was reclaiming truth for a man. And the name Ezekiel Rowe, once labeled the non-compliant man, was now being rewritten to its truth: the man who waited and was shot. One evening, after a press conference full of evasive answers inside a small break room at a district police station, a black officer sat silently before a monitor. He hadn't spoken during the meeting, didn't join the discussion channel, and posted nothing on social media. But when everyone had left, with only the ceiling fan spinning and yellow fluorescent light casting down on a cooling cup of coffee, he muttered, "We warned them, sent reports, spoke up in tactical briefings, but no one listened." That sentence wasn't recorded in any minutes, but it spread quickly, like a sigh hitting a truth many in the force had long avoided. Warnings were once ignored because they came from those without seniority or from unreliable sources. In truth, they came from voices whose skin color didn't match the decision makers. At the same time, an internal message leaked from a night shift group chat. It wasn't long, but it was enough to shake the police department's PR system for hours. "New score for the squad bonus?" The message was sent shortly after the officer who shot Mr. Ezekiel was placed on temporary leave, with no formal indictment announced. The use of the word bonus as an internal reward implication sparked outrage. Dozens of posts pointed out the rot within the very unit tasked with monitoring excessive force. Those meant to remain neutral, but instead shared messages that implicitly praised an act of killing. City officials denied the message's authenticity, claiming it could be a doctored image or external fabrication meant to disrupt public trust. However, digital forensic experts confirmed the chat originated from an internal device under the Special Review Unit's jurisdiction. This verification forced several mid-level officers to go on temporary leave. Pending internal investigation, and independent oversight bodies were recommended for intervention. Walter did not comment on the leak. He didn't have to. What he did was quote the black officer's words in a letter sent directly to the Department of Justice. "We warned them, but no one listened." He added, "And by the time they did, my father was already on the ground." The letter was never published, but lawyers were aware of it. At a private conference among civil rights organizations, someone read it aloud, word for word, nothing added, nothing removed. The entire room fell silent. No one asked if Walter had given permission, because that truth no longer belonged to any one person. At the station where the message leaked, a few began changing their profile photos in the internal chat app to a gray square, no icons, no captions. It was their quiet admission that they could no longer pretend not to know. A veteran officer filed for early retirement. On the form, he wrote only, "I once saw an old man pulled over 3 years ago, forced to the ground just for not answering quickly. I stayed silent then, but I won't stay silent anymore." Later that same day, the city's independent complaint office received an anonymous report listing 12 suspected cases of abuse tied to the same group of officers. Those files had shown signs of being removed from the system, but now they had returned. A system can only survive in silence if everyone chooses to look away. The story of Mr. Ezekiel didn't just reveal where a bullet had passed, it exposed where it was chambered, how it was excused, and the invisible nods behind the trigger. And when whispers begin to speak, even the thickest wall of silence must crack. Clyde Delmore sat in his mahogany-paneled office, light from the tall window casting a pale reflection of his pinky ring onto the edge of the file folder. On the wall behind him hung a photo of Clyde standing beside the mayor. Below it, a Distinguished Service Medal lined up precisely with a framed certificate of honor. No one in the department was unfamiliar with Clyde's name, and no one dared speak directly about what he had handled in the past. But within law enforcement, people understood that handling didn't mean justice. It meant the skill to smother smoke before it turned to fire. Clyde was the cousin of the officer who shot Mr. Ezekiel. That relationship wasn't noted in the personnel files, but anyone who had been in the system long enough knew blood ties didn't need to be declared for paperwork to shift. There had been 3 previous incidents involving excessive force, and each one ended with the same conclusion. The officer acted within authorized bounds. Clyde's name never appeared in public documents, but in each case there had been a redrafted report before it reached upper management. The footnotes on those files were nearly identical, reviewed internally, no further investigation required. The results were silence from victims, withdrawn legal representation, or evidence disqualified due to procedural delays. Walter received a call at midnight from a number not saved in his phone. The voice was rough, halting, but clear with every word. "I know what you're doing, and I won't stop you. But listen to me, Mr. Rowe. You're not fighting a man, you're fighting a wall of stone." Walters said nothing. The other end didn't wait for a response, just a sigh, and the line went dead. He sat still for a long time, eyes fixed on the headline glowing from his laptop screen. "Internal Oversight Report on Civilian Assault Unresolved." The phrase "wall of stone" echoed in his head for hours afterward. He started combing through old reports, not just on his father's case, but public archives from the past 3 years. Some copies had missing pages, some were faded, but what caught his attention was the frequency of the name Clyde Delmore, listed as consulting liaison or special handling advisor. The cases that closed without prosecution always had Clyde's shadow, never fully written out. Always just a presence. The individuals who had filed complaints later faced repercussions. One was demoted, another took medical leave, and one vanished from all personnel records. There was no direct evidence, but Walter knew he was walking on a floor slick with oil. One wrong step and everything could slip away. He was not a lawyer, nor trained in criminal investigation, but military experience had taught him how to read the language of power, not from speeches, but from the blanks and documents, the notes too clean to be real, the red stamps missing corners. Those details spoke louder than any threat. Walter reached out to a former investigator from the Internal Oversight Board, someone who had been suspended for publicly challenging the handling of an abuse case. They met in a suburban cafe, where the man handed Walter a small external drive. No long introduction, no promises, just one line. "I kept it in case someone was brave enough to dig into that stone." That night, Walter didn't go home. He opened the drive-in, a rented room. Inside were audio recordings, forgotten meeting transcripts, and internal emails never meant for public release. Clyde Delmore's name appeared repeatedly. The conversations were one-sided, but enough to reveal how Clyde steered the entire system like his own private chessboard. This time, Walter didn't take notes. He copied the entire archive and sent it to 2 addresses, one belonging to a civil rights attorney who had followed the case from the beginning, the other to an independent journalist known for exposing law enforcement misconduct. The next morning, he wrote 3 words in his notebook. The wall cracked, and he kept going, not to get revenge, but to turn over each brick until enough light poured through for others to see what had been buried. Walter didn't wait for slow-moving investigations. The same morning that news channels still debated the legitimacy of the suspension handed to the officer who killed his father, he was already at the federal office, submitting a formal request to disclose the identity, service record, and associations of Inspector Clyde Delmore. Despite attempts by the record's official to deflect, citing confidentiality protocols, Walter cited provisions from the Freedom of Information Act stating that Clyde was directly involved in the post-incident handling of the Ezekiel Rowe case, and under federal law, that could not be kept hidden. While awaiting official confirmation, Walter began mapping out Clyde's network himself. He didn't expect anyone to hand him the answers. He was far too familiar with how crucial facts often hid behind seemingly harmless details. He searched through old newspaper articles, local news segments, even field medic and personnel records from more than 30 years ago, where Clyde's name had once appeared inconspicuously among a list of battlefield support nurses. And just as he was about to move on, he noticed a short note in the appendix of an emergency medical report from a field camp. Report, approved by Chief Medic Ezekiel Rowe, Scribe, Clyde Delmore. Walter sat still. His eyes froze on that line. In his mind, fragments of memory collided all at once. Stories Mr. Ezekiel once told about wartime, vague remarks about a subordinate who had altered casualty counts to meet targets, and the way his father always ended those stories with a heavy look, as if something had been left unsaid. If Clyde had once worked directly under Ezekiel, why had no one mentioned it from the start? Why in every press conference and hearing was his name always paired with the title Senior Inspector and never associated with a military medical past? That omission couldn't be random. Walter began to suspect that the killing of Mr. Ezekiel was not simply an impulsive act of racial prejudice. Perhaps it was a long, slow-burning fuse, an unresolved grudge that never faded. He wrote it all down in his notebook. Clyde once served under my father. The motive isn't just bias. From that moment, Walter's investigation shifted. He started collecting everything his father had ever written or stored. In a wooden box under the bed, he found a copy of a complaint letter from the medical camp, the handwriting shaky but still legible. Nurse Clyde D. altered field casualty data. I refused to sign the revised report. Beneath it was the signature of Ezekiel Rowe. The letter had no response. It had never been sent. It had stayed in the box for over 30 years, as if his father knew that one day someone would need it. Walter didn't go to the media. He sent a copy of the letter to the federal prosecutor's office with a brief note attached. "This is the motive you missed." 3 days later, he received notice. The investigation would be expanded, not just into the murder, but into past conflicts, cover-ups, and connections that might have compromised the integrity of the trial process. More importantly, Walter began to see clearly what had once only been a vague intuition. Clyde had not acted out of impulse. He had acted to erase a stain from the past. A man named Ezekiel Rowe. A man who once refused to bow, even when everyone else did. And now, his son was standing in that same place, not to avenge, but to unearth what Clyde had tried to bury with power. The audio recording appeared unexpectedly. It arrived as a lone attachment in the inbox of the civil rights attorney representing Walter, accompanied by a subject line that read, "Listen closely." In a closed meeting room, 3 people sat silently around the speaker. The audio started with a slight hiss, then came through, no background noise, no wind. I hate it when black folks hold their heads up like that. The attorney looked up, eyes resting on Walter. No one had to ask what it meant. In Walter's context, at the moment just after Mr. Ezekiel had been shot, such a statement couldn't be a random quote, and it was far from harmless. They immediately sent the recording to the state's audio forensic lab. An independent analysis team was assembled within 24 hours. Voice matching was conducted using harmonic resonance and frequency variant software. The final result was entered into the federal investigation file, a 97% match to the voice of the officer who had fired the shot at Mr. Ezekiel Rowe. The recording became a pivotal piece of evidence, not only for its racist content, but for establishing intent, a factor rarely provable in civilian shootings by police. Normally, defense attorneys could cite emotional distress, situational urgency, or personal error, but when an officer is recorded making a derogatory statement, bias is no longer speculation. It becomes grounds for establishing premeditation. Walter held the analysis in his hands, eyes fixed on the signature of the acoustic expert. What he felt wasn't triumph, it was clarity. All this time, he had been fighting in a fog where every step was clouded by layers of power, policy, and distorted fear. Now, at least, there was one piece of sound, clear and independent, that could not be denied. Federal prosecutors immediately expanded the charges. The officer would no longer be tried solely for use of deadly force in the line of duty, but also for racially motivated deadly violence. That change meant harsher sentencing guidelines and narrower immunity protections. Meanwhile, police defense lawyers launched multiple countermeasures, from questioning the legal chain of custody to floating the idea of synthetic voice manipulation. But the forensic lab shut that down quickly. The recording showed unique vocal resonance patterns that couldn't be replicated without the source input. Furthermore, the file's metadata confirmed it had been captured nearly 2 weeks before the shooting at a small off-duty gathering within the patrol unit. What outraged the public even more was that after the clip leaked to the media, many recognized the phrase. Several individuals who had encountered the officer came forward, saying they had heard something similar. A woman working in emergency services recalled, "He once joked about showing black men who's in charge. I just never thought it would turn real like this." Walter made no public statement, but he sent a handwritten note to the prosecutor's office. It contained only one sentence. That voice didn't fire the gun, it pulled the trigger. In a closed-door meeting of the investigative panel, The lead prosecutor read the line aloud before signing the amended indictment. The legal battle was far from over, but the recording had unlocked a different kind of door, not one of sympathy or debate, but a cold corridor leading straight into the heart of the system, where hateful whispers, long thought to be forever buried, now echoed loud enough to strike at the walls protecting power. And every time that clip was played again, people no longer heard just a sentence. They heard a confession. Clyde Delmore entered the internal hearing like a man accustomed to controlling the room. The way he adjusted his cuffs in front of the camera, the way he leaned lightly against the backrest, all revealed the confidence of someone who had once commanded dozens of sensitive investigations. When the recording was introduced, he did not look at the screen, nor did Walter. He simply flipped through the folder in front of him and said calmly, "This evidence was collected without lawful authorization. I move to dismiss its legal validity due to procedural violations." That sentence caused the entire room to pause for a second. The lead prosecutor furrowed his brow, not out of surprise, but disappointment. Everyone knew Clyde would grasp at any loophole, but his choice to challenge the method of presentation rather than the content itself made one thing clear. He did not care what had been heard, only whether it could collapse the structure he was trying to protect. Walter did not look at him. He stood up straight, without waiting for an invitation to speak, without citing any legal precedent. He pulled out a copy of the letter Mr. Aziel had once written. The letter that was never sent, the one detailing Clyde's prior misconduct in falsifying casualty records. He did not raise it high. He simply held it in his hand, voice lowered. "I don't need anyone to speak. I just need someone willing to listen." That line was not entered into the official hearing transcript, but the internal clerk later admitted that their pen had paused, unsure whether to record it word for word. It was not a plea, and even less a political statement. It was a boundary between those who chose to listen and those who had long chosen to cover their ears. From that moment, the dynamic shifted. Some members of the internal affairs team began proactively re-examining old case files, cases previously overseen by Clyde, testimonies once dismissed, and cameras that had accidentally malfunctioned at the right moment. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew silence could no longer shield a system already cracking from within. Media were not allowed inside the courtroom, but fragments of information still leaked out through private channels. A veteran reporter wrote, "I wasn't allowed in, but an investigator sent me this line. Today, someone stood up and everyone listened." That sentence spread quickly, becoming a quiet but steady signal of change. Clyde continued to appeal, citing federal law and personnel confidentiality protections. But each time he spoke, people no longer saw him as a figure of authority. They saw him as a wall, thick and cold, but slowly fracturing brick by brick under the weight of voices that had never been heard before. Walter held no press conference, gave no interviews. He simply sent another handwritten letter, this time to the person Clyde had once forced out for speaking up. In the letter, he wrote, "I'm not sure the voice in the recording is enough to convict, but I believe when we can't speak, we must choose. Either stay silent forever or let truth speak for us." The recipient gave no reply, but 1 week later, they appeared at the next hearing as a witness. No introduction was needed. They opened with just one sentence. "I was once asked to rewrite a report. I refused, and I was reassigned 7 days later." The story gradually shed its administrative dispute veneer and revealed its core, a system that once chose to compromise with wrongdoing, once believed silence would let things pass. But, as Walter had said, he did not demand that people take his side. He only needed enough of them willing to listen. And now, those people were beginning to step out of the shadows. Walter entered the courtroom with his back straight, dressed in dark clothes that did not refer to his rank or past missions. On his wrist, Mr. Ezekiel's old watch was strapped tightly, a fixed point in time marking his loss. He sat quietly in the back row, among strangers who had come for different reasons. outrage, curiosity, empathy, but all eyes faced the same direction, the bench, where a life had been ended by the gun of someone with the authority to pull the trigger. The prosecution opened with a calm voice. The attorney, silver-haired and composed, said, "We are not here to deliver angry words. We are here to present the truth." The victim did not resist. The victim stood there. The victim was a father waiting for his son to come home, just like any other day. The opening line silenced the room. Those taking notes paused, as if to make sure they heard correctly. In the back row, Walter clenched his fingers, nails pressing into his palms until they turned white. He didn't need his name spoken during the plea, but each word felt like a knock on memories still warm with blood. The lawyer didn't dramatize. He referenced stills from the footage, describing lighting, angles, without sentiment. Every time he mentioned Mr. Ezekiel, he used his full name, never reducing him to the subject or the involved party. Throughout the presentation, he looked up only once, while showing the frame of Mr. Ezekiel sitting on the curb, still holding the grocery bag. This is the person the defendant claimed was a threat to public safety. Walter kept his eyes on that image, not to deepen the pain, but to remember that this trial was not just about the number of years in a sentence. It was about redefining how a death is seen by those who claim to uphold justice. The attorney moved forward, presenting each piece of evidence: the 97% voice match to the officer, the contents of the leaked recording, and testimonies previously dismissed as lacking weight. Each came with a forensic expert's cold, concise evaluation, not a word wasted. The defense remained largely silent. Their attorney focused on procedure, whether the evidence was collected lawfully, whether the situation gave the officer reason to feel threatened, as his report claimed. But each argument seemed to fall into a void that everyone who had seen the video could feel. The silence didn't come from fear, but from the inability to justify such blatant wrong. During the recess, no one spoke to Walter. They just nodded or placed a hand gently on his shoulder in passing. There were no condolences. Everyone understood that no words could fill the space left by a father killed while waiting for his son. As the court resumed, Walter still didn't speak. He let the system examine itself through each cross-examination, through each glance from the jury. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted the truth to speak for itself. Without military rank, without a hero's armor, he was just a son in court, watching to see who would stand on the side of what was right and who would keep sitting still as death knocked on someone else's door. The defendant's statement stirred the room, not because of its tone, but because of the suffocating absurdity. The attorney representing the police department stood upright, reading each word slowly, as if trying to make it sound reasonable. "We believe the victim's behavior could be interpreted as threatening, given the tense circumstances and lack of information at the scene." He looked up, as if to gauge reactions, his stepping backward, keeping his hands close to his body, and not cooperating, were factors that caused confusion and compelled the officer to make a rapid decision to ensure public safety. Around the room, a few stunned glances turned toward one another. A woman placed her hand over her chest, as if to calm a rising breath. Behind her, an elderly man tugged down his mask and muttered 2 words. "Again, huh?" Walter remained seated until the phrase, "that old man," was repeated a second time in the same argument. Then he tilted his head, pressed his lips together, and let out a short laugh, not loud, not mocking, more like a reflex to words too brazen to endure. He stood, without asking permission, without turning to anyone, and looked directly at the podium. "Threatening because my father wore a white shirt instead of a vest, or because his hands shook in the cold?" The air thickened. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. A reminder, but no one asked Walter to be quiet. His words were not theatrical, not drawn out. They were a sliver of irony, beneath which boiled a quiet rage. An old man waiting for his son, holding a grocery bag, looking straight ahead and speaking clearly, "And that, to you, was more dangerous than an armed suspect?" He turned toward the jury, voice slowing, nearly a whisper. "Then maybe your definition of threat is aimed at the wrong person." The defense attorney did not respond. He looked down, flipped through papers, trying to cover silence with mechanical movement. But the silence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to those who had heard, who had seen, and who now had to ask themselves whether the system they trusted truly protected them or merely codified fear into commands. A juror, a white woman, about 50, jotted something quickly in her notebook. Her eyes didn't meet Walter's, but her throat swallowed hard. Not from emotion, but from confronting her definition of justice. Walter sat back down, his back not touching the chair. His eyes stayed fixed on the officer, whose head was bowed, his face pale. Clyde Delmore sat 2 rows behind, hands on his knees, unmoving. Walter didn't look at him, but in his gaze it was clear who stood at the center of a storm still rising. When the defense lawyer asked to proceed, his voice caught mid-sentence. We believe the situation at the scene exceeded the reasonable judgment capacity of an officer. If there was an error, it stemmed from situational pressure, not malicious intent. That justification fell into the space in people's minds where once there had been hope, then forgiveness, and now only coldness. The judge made a note. The prosecution quietly prepared his reply, and below, Walter closed his eyes, not to calm himself, but to remember his father's face in that final second. A face that had never threatened anyone. A face that once smiled and said, "Hurry up, son, it's cold out." No one expected the next witness at that day's hearing to be a young female officer. Her face pale, but her eyes steady. She stood at the witness stand with both hands clenched, taking a deep breath like someone who had just cleared the final barrier between fear and herself. When asked about the behavior of the officer who fired the shot, she looked forward and spoke directly, without hesitation. "I've seen him do that before." The room seemed to slow. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, hand reaching for his pen. The judge looked up. Walter sat still, eyes fixed on the woman standing in the circle of testimony. She swallowed, then continued. "A year ago, during a routine traffic stop, he pulled his gun, no warning, no valid reason. The target was a young man, 21 years old, also black." She paused, breathing harder. "I stayed silent because I didn't think I had enough seniority to challenge a superior." The sound of a pen tapping lightly against a table echoed clearly. A few people turned to look at Clyde Delmore, seated in the back. His expression didn't change, but his right hand shifted on his thigh, a defensive reflex. The officer glanced that way, revealing a flicker of unease. But she didn't retract her statement. "If I had spoken up earlier, maybe Mr. Ezekiel wouldn't be lying on the ground now." Walter turned away, covering his mouth. He didn't cry, but his shoulders stalled for a few seconds. The prosecutor nodded in thanks and turned toward Clyde, now invited to respond. He stood, walking slowly to the front, his sleeves neatly adjusted, shoes polished to a mirror shine. But when the microphone switched on, his voice no longer carried the tone of those internal briefings. It was dry, fragmented, and deliberately vague. "I don't recall the specific incident she's referring to," Clyde said, eyes dodging the camera. "I wasn't involved in the actions of any frontline officers on the day Mr. Ezekiel Rowe was killed." The prosecutor offered no reply. The silence after that statement said more than any rebuttal. No one in the courtroom mistook the meaning behind the words, "I wasn't involved." A man with 30 years in the department, credited with training over half the current force, now claimed no basic supervisory knowledge. One reporter leaned to a colleague and scribbled in his notebook, "Top brass can't remember who his subordinates shot." A few eyes shifted toward Walter, waiting for a reaction, but he remained still, eyes half closed, as if containing something he refused to let loose. Behind him, an elderly black man sighed, "Same uniform, different heart." The judge nodded, calling for a 15-minute recess. The room emptied slowly while Walter stepped into the hallway, where sunlight had just broken through a narrow window pane. He stood there, gripping the edge of his coat. In the light, his fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but because his body was registering every word spoken as if etched into stone. As the witnesses cleared the chamber, the courtroom quieted like a space freshly emerged from a storm of testimony. Walter didn't rise. He sat in the middle row, hands interlocked, eyes down on the faded wooden floor. But when Clyde walked past, avoiding eye contact, and carrying himself as if life had left no burden behind, Walter stood and moved toward the podium reserved for personal statements. "I lost a father. You all lost your memory. What game are we playing here?" The question dropped into a silence no one dared interrupt. A few people turned their heads. Some veteran officers lowered theirs, not in guilt, but in speechless uncertainty. A few defense attorneys paused mid-typing. They didn't know what to write next. Walter didn't let the question become just another accusation. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on Clyde sitting at the back of the courtroom. "If you don't remember the person who once worked with you, if you don't remember the incident from a year ago, if you don't remember a face that once had a gun pressed to its forehead, then is memory in this profession not about truth but about choice?" His voice wasn't raised, but it was firm as steel. The old judge, known for his toughness and brevity, stared at Walter without blinking. In his eyes there was no pity, only recognition. He nodded slightly, slowly, as if each movement carried weight. "You have reason to ask that," he said, his voice low, like the sound of a wooden door closing in the night. "And I believe there are trials where listening matters less than facing what's in front of us." Behind them, a quiet cough broke the silence, but no one turned. Walter sat down again, his hands still clenched. A prosecutor nodded to him from across the room. No handshake, no compliment. Here the only thing acknowledged was truth. And truth did not need posturing. Clyde remained silent, his gaze distant as if counting the bricks on the wall. But if one looked closely, they could see a vein pulsing at his wrist. He knew the time for hiding in the dark was running out. No one spoke blame aloud. But every stare, every piece of evidence, every question, like a nail struck deep, made his silence no longer evasion, but an unspoken confession. The hearing continued, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer a place for debate between law and logic. It had become a space where gaps in memory were dragged into the light, where each person had to face what they had tried to forget, ignore, or conceal. And at the center of that room, Walter remained, not as a soldier, but as a son. He wasn't demanding justice arrive that moment, nor forcing anyone to change overnight. But with that single, pointed question, he had pierced the thickest wall, the one wrapped around the conscience of an entire system. And from that point on, no trial would ever be the same again. On an otherwise ordinary morning, an anonymous email landed directly in the inbox of the temporary federal investigative team, containing 4 embedded links to the NYPD's internal system. In the attached note, the sender wrote, "I used to be part of that system. I used to stay silent, but this time I can't." The officer had retired and remained unidentified, leaving only one final sentence. "Clyde has buried at least 4 similar cases in the past, and he always knew how to make them disappear." The names of the victims were listed with specific dates and times, all black citizens, all arrested or subdued in incidents with no initial reporting. Some had no formal case numbers, only scattered mentions and email exchanges between officers. What stood out most to the investigators was a repeated pattern, direct or indirect involvement from Clyde Delmore. He consistently appeared at the final steps of the process, where the decision was made whether a case would be internally closed or not. Within 12 hours of the email surfacing, a major television network aired a story titled "Alleged Cover-Up of Systemic Violations Inside NYPD," opening with an image of Clyde at the department's 30th anniversary celebration. The screen is split into 4 quadrants, each showing one of the cases, location, time, and ending with the cold caption, "No action taken." The anchor closed the segment with a single line, "Sometimes justice isn't delayed, it's locked in someone's filing cabinet." On social media, the hashtag 4timesunpunished gained traction. One account, run by a former medical staffer, wrote, "I witnessed one of these. The victim was my friend's father. The case file vanished after a 10-minute meeting. Shares multiplied by the hour, not through sensational images, but from first-hand statements. Blunt, short, and honest enough to steal breath." In a post with over 500,000 engagements, A veteran journalist published an old photo of NYPD headquarters from 2016, marked with 4 red dots showing the locations where the buried incidents took place. The caption read simply, "I was ordered to pull this story 7 years ago. Today, I write it again, and no one gets to pull it now." In the temporary office of the investigation unit, the lead coordinator placed both hands on a freshly printed dossier sourced from the anonymous tip. She flipped through the pages without taking notes, underlining only the names she recognized. Clyde had not lied by saying he didn't know. He had only learned how to make everyone else forget. As the wave gathered force, it went beyond calls for individual accountability. Demands for a full federal-level independent investigation appeared in national broadcasts, editorial columns, and official petitions from 3 civil rights organizations. A group of former officers signed a joint open letter to the Department of Justice. If those 4 cases were closed due to lack of evidence, then here we are the evidence. We were told to clear annotations. We were threatened for refusing. And we remember. In another corner of the city, Walter opened a case file sent directly by the investigation team. In bold red letters it read, "Connection to Mr. Ezekiel Rowe case? High." He didn't smile nor look surprised. He simply folded the page, placed it on the table, and stared out the window. The sky that day was quiet, like a wall just beginning to crack, and everyone knew, if what the file revealed was true, those very cracks might be the ones to collapse the entire system Clyde once believed to be untouchable. Amid the flood of breaking news and viral hashtags, a name long scrubbed from internal systems reemerged. Her name was Marcia Elkins, formerly a mid-level coordinator in the NYPD's Internal Oversight Division. Nearly 8 years ago, she had been recognized for her diligence in auditing internal conduct and flagging irregularities before files could be altered. But 1 year later, her name vanished from all performance reviews. The administrative record claimed voluntary resignation for personal reasons. Marcia did not return through any formal press conference. She chose a small auditorium inside a local community college, where she had taught part-time since being forced out. An amateur camera faced her, the lighting uneven, the mic slightly fuzzy, but her words cut through every wall. She opened a laptop and projected a series of internal emails with verified addresses, including correspondence from Clyde Delmore himself. "I once objected to closing the case of a black victim named Jonathan Reeves. The reason cited was insufficient video evidence, even though we had 4 witness statements and photos from the scene. I filed a request to keep the case open until the next review cycle. The next morning I was reassigned to logistics. I never signed a resignation, and I never forgot," she said. Everyone in the room remained silent as she read aloud excerpts from the files that had been shelved. She didn't cry, nor did she raise her voice. Her expression was that of someone who had learned to live with a conscience long suppressed, and now had nothing left to hold back. "I have nothing left to lose, but I still have my dignity, and apparently that's enough to return." Ever since the name Clyde Delmore appeared again in the case of Mr. Ezekiel Rowe. That same evening, the video of Marcia's testimony spread rapidly across multiple platforms. There was no editing, no added subtitles, yet the view count surpassed 3 million in 24 hours. Viewers left comments, not filled with rage, but in quiet solidarity. "I am the child of someone who was wrongfully held in an NYPD cell in 2012. I believe you." Another account wrote, "When silence is betrayed by truth itself, it's no longer betrayal, it's awakening." At the investigation office, Walter received a full transcript of Marcia's statement. He read each line under the glow of his desk lamp, his face unmoved. But in his eyes, something closed, and something else began. When asked for comment during a closed-door session among involved parties, he said only one sentence, no more, no less. "Justice is not gagged, it's just waiting for someone brave enough to pull the tape off." That line was quoted across media outlets at lightning speed, but Walter offered nothing further. He didn't share personal feelings, didn't respond to the praise beginning to surface here and there. He understood the core of this battle was never about turning one individual into a hero. It was about giving back the weight of truth to the voices of those who had once been pushed aside, silenced, and made invisible. And when someone like Marcia dares to step out of the dark, other doors begin to crack open too. Silence is no longer whole. What Clyde once believed he had buried was now rising, one truth at a time. More than 30 years ago, in a war-zone field hospital, the names Ezekiel Rowe and Clyde Delmore appeared together in assignment records. They weren't close, but fate placed them on the same night shift when a young soldier, fatally wounded in a training mishap, was brought in. Clyde, in charge of casualty logs, proposed labeling it as a combat injury to protect morale and avoid scrutiny. Ezekiel, his medical coat still soaked in blood, stood before the report table and simply said, "I won't make his parents believe a lie." Then he rewrote the report by hand, attaching evidence himself. The incident faded with time, but not for Clyde. Years later, as Ezekiel was up for promotion, a harsh review suddenly surfaced authored by Clyde. Though full of vague criticisms, it was ultimately overruled. From that moment, Ezekiel never mentioned Clyde again, but he understood. Some people don't silence others with weapons, but with paperwork, revisions, and half-truths designed to erase defiance. He never expected to cross paths with Clyde again. But decades later, in a courtroom under public scrutiny, their history resurfaced. Journalists traced old documents, connected names, and exposed a trail of manipulated reports tied to Clyde. Quiet resentment that had simmered for years now cracked wide open. Walter received a letter from a retired medic who had served with his father. The ink had faded, but the message was clear. "Your father never bowed to power. Serving with him was my honor." Walter placed the letter in the pocket where he kept his father's keepsakes. He felt no rage, just a sharpened stillness. This fight didn't begin with a trigger. It began the moment men like Clyde believed the truth could be edited out of history. And now, though Clyde had yet to bow, the things he had buried in the past were beginning to surface, line by line, word by word, testimony by testimony. This was no longer just about two men in a makeshift medical room. It was a confrontation between two ways of life, one that believes in protecting power, and another that believes in the truth, even at a cost. The letter arrived early in the morning, just as Walter returned from a meeting with the investigation team. It came in a worn yellow envelope, handwritten in a gentle, slanted script with no sender, only the line, "To Walter Rowe, son of Ezekiel." Inside was a folded sheet, a few brief lines in fading blue ink smudged at the end. "I was the nurse assigned alongside your father during the Western Field Campaign. He never bowed to power, not even in war, and he never needed recognition for it." Walter sat quietly, eyes reddening, though his hands were steady. He'd only known fragments, stories of his father saving men under fire, stitching wounds with trembling hands, carrying his wife's letter for over 20 years. But this was the first time someone who stood beside him had put that truth into writing, the truth the system tried to erase. When he shared the letter with the team, a federal attorney simply nodded. "Some evidence doesn't need legal proof. It's valid because it reaches the conscience." Walter knew then this wasn't personal anymore. It wasn't just about a father before his son. It had become a test of values. Stay silent for dignity or bend the truth for power. Clyde had always chosen the latter. He never pulled a trigger, never showed up at a scene, but his name surfaced in nearly every doctored report. He moved the system like chess, his words outweighing truth. But the truth, once enough people stand, becomes a force no wall can stop. Ezekiel chose silence, not out of fear, but because he believed justice had its time. He lived simply, raised his son, and carried his pain quietly until his death forced the past back into daylight. Walter saw it unfold daily, old witnesses reaching out, sealed files reopened, deleted articles spreading again. The system's cracks were visible now, and he knew this wasn't the moment to back down. "My father didn't bow," he told a reporter, "because some things aren't meant to be silenced, war or not." The room fell still. No one asked more. Walter wasn't speaking for attention. He was bridging two paths: Clyde's path of self-preservation Ezekiel's path of quiet integrity. And now he was choosing what justice should sound like: clear, unshaken, and finally heard. In the courtroom packed with people, not a single clap broke the air when the judge read the verdict. The silence wasn't due to a lack of feeling, but rather a kind of emotion held so tightly it became stillness. In the front row, Walter stared directly at the officer who had shot his father. His gaze no longer held rage like in the early days, only a chilling calm, as if he had shed every hope for correction and left behind one thing: facing the truth. 30 years in federal prison with no eligibility for parole, no clemency under any condition. The judge's voice was steady, each word landing like a knock against iron. The officer lowered his head, showing no reaction, no apology, no final words. He didn't look up, but everyone could see his shoulders shake, like a man only now realizing that his career and freedom had plummeted into the abyss because of one drunken, arrogant pull of a trigger. But the harshest blow came with the sentence for Clyde Delmore. Once a senior inspector who had walked through dozens of lawsuits untouched, he now stood under the courtroom lights, no gold-plated watch on his wrist, no authority in his voice. When the judge announced, 18 years in prison for evidence tampering, information suppression, witness intimidation, and abuse of power during tenure, no one in the room showed surprise. Every detail had already been laid bare over weeks of hearings, but it was the long silence after the verdict that stood out most. Walter didn't take his eyes off Clyde. He didn't need a confession. What mattered had already happened. One of the seemingly untouchable walls within the system had collapsed. A man who once sat in the director's seat, signing off on internal denials, now stood as a defendant judged by the very system he thought he could manipulate forever. As Walter left the courthouse, he didn't speak. Reporters surged toward him. Microphones raised, questions thrown rapidly. How do you feel? Was it enough? Do you forgive? He walked slowly, keeping a deliberate distance. On his wrist was still his father Ezekiel's old watch, not for the time, but as a reminder. One step before entering the car, he turned back and said only, "Justice is not a feeling, it's an outcome." Inside the courtroom, those who had seen the video of Ezekiel being shot recalled the final image: him standing tall, not fleeing, not falling to his knees, not begging. He was shot while holding his stance, waiting for his son. And today's verdict affirmed that stance, unbowed. In the final report of the federal investigation, Clyde's name appeared not just in this case, but was also linked to 5 other files closed under questionable circumstances. Plans to reopen those cases were underway, and past victims, many now elderly, were being called in to uncover the full truth, not for vengeance, but to end a cycle of pain long legalized by silence. In prison, Clyde refused all media interviews. In his final opportunity to speak, he did not explain. Some said he was old, exhausted, and remorseful, but no one cared anymore. Because in this story, remorse only mattered if it could have stopped a father from being shot in the street. And Clyde had that chance, but chose not to act. And so, in a society that had turned its back on justice too many times, the sentencing of the officer in Clyde was more than the closing of a case. It was confirmation that there are limits, and when crossed, even the system must confront itself. No gunfire needed, no banners raised. Justice can still walk in the form of a son who refuses to let go. Walter left the courtroom while the judge's voice still echoed behind him. The door closed softly. No one stopped him. No one asked for a statement. He had heard enough. No sentence could wash the blood from his father's shirt or bring back that afternoon when a father stood waiting and was killed by men who wore the law. For Walter, verdicts were not endings. They were links between a past undone and a loss he would carry for life. He walked down the steps quietly. No cameras, no reporters, just a black boy at the bottom holding a printed photo of Ezekiel. The boy didn't understand it all, but watched Walter with the eyes of someone hoping for an answer. Walter paused, looked at him. No words, just a nod. Then he moved on. Inside, the old judge stayed behind. He set down his glasses, placed the verdict on the desk. When asked if he wanted anything added to the record, he shook his head and said, "Justice isn't a win. Sometimes It's what happens next. It wasn't recorded or quoted, but those who remained felt the truth of it, something long known but rarely said aloud. To Walter, justice wasn't prison time or public apologies. It wasn't headlines or praise. It was truth revealed, silences broken, and children seeing the world not turn away. The next the judge spoke of was this: those once shielded are now held accountable. At Ezekiel's house, Walter opened the door, untouched for months. The dust, the shirt, the open book, the worn teacup, all still there. He sat, placed his hand on his father's old watch, and waited, as Ezekiel once did. A letter confirmed new investigations into Clyde's past cases. Walter's name wasn't needed. That didn't ease the pain, but it was motion, a continuation. At the street corner, people placed a stone. He stood tall, though no one asked him to. Walter didn't attend. He returned to base to train recruits. But before he left a note under the stone. No name, no message. Just 3 words: I continue, Dad. Walter wasn't surprised when news broke that a lieutenant officer submitted his resignation just after the trial. The man had no direct ties to the case, nor was he under Clyde's command, but chose to step away with a letter addressed to the mayor and publicly posted on the internal network. I can no longer serve in a system that once allowed this to happen. Reform or not, I can't wear the badge while Mr. Ezekiel's image still haunts me, he wrote. The letter spread rapidly in law enforcement circles, not for shock value, but because it touched the deepest silence among those who had once looked away. Walter read it on an ordinary morning, expressionless. On his desk sat a small wooden box, filled with handwritten letters from a retired officer, a file clerk who once processed Clyde's paperwork, and a nurse who worked with his father. Some apologized sincerely, without embellishment. I didn't intervene. Now I understand I was part of it, one said. Others signed only with initials. Walter never replied. He didn't plan to turn guilt into a movement, but he kept them all, neatly stacked, unread, because their mere existence was an admission. Sometimes that was all that mattered. The media analyzed everything: public apologies, resignation clips, and past transcripts. But Walter stayed detached. He knew his father's story hadn't started with a bullet. It began with people believing detachment was their right. And it wouldn't end with a sentence, but when someone finally asked, "Where was I when it happened?" Beneath that media noise, Walter quietly kept his word. No interviews, no panels, no posts. He returned to training young recruits. When asked what to do if a superior gave a wrong order, he paused, then said, "My father taught me you don't choose between obeying and resisting. You choose whether to live as someone responsible." That night, he opened one letter. A middle-aged woman wrote in faded ink, "Mr. Ezekiel once saved my son at a gas station. I never got to thank him. Now, I just want to say, I'm sorry I didn't speak when I should have." Walter folded the note, placed it beside his father's photo, and touched the frame gently. The lamp on his desk stayed lit well into the night, not for work, but because something inside him had quietly shifted, like a river finding new flow after a dam breaks. Days after the verdict, a young father posted a photo of his 6-year-old son watching the news. "He asked me why that man was killed," the caption read. "I wanted to say the world is cruel, but I couldn't. I showed him the clip. Today I wrote to the local council. I still don't have answers, but now I have action." It went viral, not from emotion, but because readers saw themselves in it. Walter didn't react publicly, but not long after, he appeared unannounced at a high school's social justice week. Sitting quietly in the back, he listened. When a student asked, "If you were a witness, what would you do?" a teacher rose and said, "I'd like to introduce someone who lived that answer. Walter Rowe." The room fell silent. There was no speech. No lecture. Walter said only one sentence. "I didn't come here to tell a story. I came to hear what young people think about justice, because I've seen adults stay silent for too long." Then he stepped aside, sat in a plastic chair near the podium, and let the microphone pass from student to student. For nearly an hour, Walter didn't interrupt. A brown-skinned student spoke about being stopped by police after school for riding a bike without lights. An Asian girl shared how her PE teacher kept calling her by the wrong name for 3 months and never corrected it. A white boy admitted, "I once stayed quiet when my friend called someone a slur. I thought it was just a joke, but now I realize it left a mark." At the end, when the teacher asked if he had any closing thoughts, Walter looked around the room. His voice was low, without judgment. "Maybe justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts when you choose to stand. You don't have to shout, just stand firm." Then he left. No group photo, no signature on the board, no business card left behind. The next day, the school received over 50 emails from parents asking for the same session in other classrooms. In the principal's office, a small note was taped beside the guest chair. If fear made people bow their heads, the next generation must learn to stand for what's right. Walter's story wasn't finished, but in that small room filled with soft yellow light and the hesitant voices of 16-year-olds, people finally named what society had long avoided. Silence is an action, not neutrality. And sometimes, the quiet presence of someone who once lost everything is the reason others finally find the courage to speak. On the street where Mr. Ezekiel once stood waiting for his son, a wooden bench appeared one Monday morning. It faced a gray stone wall, next to a faded dark stain on the sidewalk that no cleaning could erase. The bench, made of raw pine, was hand-sawn and assembled roughly but solidly. On its seat, a small inscription had been carved with a knife. "Don't leave too quickly." No one in the neighborhood asked who placed it there. The first to sit was an elderly man walking his small dog. He sat for a while, then pulled out an old photo from his pocket, a black and white picture of a soldier, faintly resembling Ezekiel. A little girl passing by stopped and asked, "Whose bench is this?" The man smiled without answering, but the next day the girl returned with her mother, bringing 2 painted stones to place beside its legs. No one called it a memorial. No one posted signs or laid flowers. Yet for 2 weeks, one by one, students, bus drivers, postal workers, and even the unhoused paused there. Some sat, some stood, others just bowed their heads. A middle-aged woman came at dawn and left a bag of oranges. A young man left a handwritten note. "I was once silent. Now I'm learning to stay." Walter didn't hear of the bench through the news, but through an anonymous email with a photo. In it, a black woman sat quietly, holding a small notebook, her gaze distant. Behind her, the bench stood, ordinary, but heavy with the weight of memory, carried by all who had sat there. One afternoon, Walter arrived. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't hide his face. He walked slowly, paused before the bench, then sat. In his hand was a small folded paper on which his father had once written, "When you see people mistreated, remember, you were raised not to bow your head." Walter slid the note beneath the wooden slat and left without a word. Later, some residents suggested adding a plaque or a small statue of Mr. Ezekiel. The idea was quietly dismissed. An old woman said, "If he didn't ask for recognition while alive, don't force remembrance through cold metal." Another added, "Those who want to understand will sit on their own." The media covered the bench, but headlines remained plain. A new seat on an old corner. And truly, what drew people there wasn't curiosity. It was that in a city always rushing, where no one has time to stop, this was a place asking nothing except that you breathe and think. The story of Walter and Mr. Ezekiel was no longer in the spotlight, but the bench, strangely, became a quiet destination for those feeling powerless, for those whose truths had been twisted, or for those who needed reminding that justice doesn't only live in verdicts, but in choosing to stay and listen. The sky darkened earlier than usual. Gray streaks of clouds stretched as if bowing lower than normal. On the simple wooden bench, a young mother sat with her son, arms wrapped in a thin scarf. The boy turned, eyes fixed on the darkened patch beneath their feet, then asked softly, "Who stood here before?" His mother looked at him, then ahead into the space before them. She didn't answer right away. Her words came only after a long, measured breath. "Someone who waited for a son who was never late." The child asked nothing more, but he placed his small hand on the bench, right where the words, "Don't leave too quickly," had begun to fade with sun and rain. Something in that gesture stilled the mother, as if her child had just taught her a quiet lesson. A breeze passed, carrying the smell of wet earth, scattering yellow leaves into a natural circle around the bend. The rain came, not heavy but enough to send people scurrying for cover, except the bench. Someone was still sitting. An old man in a worn baseball cap, thick coat, and holding a wooden umbrella quietly walked up and sat at the end of the bench. He looked at no one and carried nothing but a pair of sunken eyes. Leaning back against the rough wood, he pulled from his pocket a crumpled envelope and unfolded an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "He Waited." Below it was a photo of a middle-aged man, his face quiet but not sad, as if he had accepted every outcome. No one needed to ask what the old man was thinking. No one needed to know what he had witnessed. His presence, in the cold rain, was already a complete story. 2 college students stopped by, intending to take shelter from the rain, then paused when they saw 2 people already seated. They changed their minds and stood back a little, not wanting to interrupt. The girl whispered to her boyfriend, "I read about this story, but I didn't think it was real." He nodded slightly and placed his coat over her shoulders. They didn't leave right away, but stood silently for a few more minutes before merging back into the traffic. Under the drizzle, everything seemed to slow down. Raindrops tapped softly on the wood, mixing with the cold mist on the shoulders of the seated, but no one stood up. The rain became part of the shared memory, as if nature too wanted to bow with the people, with a sorrow that had no name. In a far corner, a photojournalist raised his camera, then lowered it. He chose not to shoot, knowing some moments don't need to be kept through a lens, but through silence. His article the next day included no image, only one paragraph. In a cold, rainy city, there is still a place where hearts stay warm enough to sit beside each other without needing to know each other's names. Walter read the article late at night. He was somewhere else, far from the city, yet he knew every turn in the story. Not because he followed it, but because people kept sending pieces of it, photos, notes, small accounts tied to that bench. A child left a postcard, a retired soldier placed his old badge, a mother left a box of leftovers. None left their name. Among the many responses, Walter held on to one sentence, handwritten with no return address. He didn't wait in vain, because ever since he stood there, many have learned how to arrive on time, with the truth, with justice, and with themselves. A year later, the neighborhood had changed. Trees were replanted, roads repaved, and sidewalks relaid with clean gray bricks. Old iron benches were replaced with waterproof composite ones. New streetlights lined the road, glowing automatically at dusk. Everything looked newer, cleaner, but the wooden bench where Mr. Ezekiel once collapsed remained. It hadn't been polished or moved. When someone proposed replacing it, the suggestion came back rejected, with a handwritten note, "Don't touch that bench. It belongs here more than the sidewalk does." No orders needed, just quiet agreement. The city changed, but the bench stayed. Soon, the police precinct got a new captain, Henry Harlow, a quiet man from East Brooklyn's community unit. A year earlier, he had sent Walter a handwritten letter. "I didn't know Mr. Ezekiel, but I read his file. It made me ashamed." On his first day, Henry didn't appear on TV. He walked the street, met shopkeepers, and stopped silently by the bench. In the office, he reviewed every unresolved complaint from the past 3 years, marking cases with delayed. His methods spoke louder than any speech. Walter found out not through the news, but through a photo emailed by a resident. Henry standing by the bench, listening to something unsaid. Walter printed the photo and tucked it into his father's old notebook, beside the line, "Don't let anyone strip your dignity, not even with a glance." No ceremony marked 1 year since Mr. Ezekiel's death, but people still came. They left pencils, notes, painted stones, a quiet pledge. I remember, in the police department's year-end report, a small line read, "Since April, 92% of complaints were addressed within 15 days. Maybe it's the new system, or maybe It's a bench that taught us not to forget. Walter didn't post it online. He called a former teammate and said, "Some things have changed. Maybe it's time we go back. To listen, not fight." That day, later called Step Back Day, the neighborhood paused. At exactly 5:30, people stopped, faced the bench. No shouting, no signs. Just one step back, arms at their sides, eyes fixed forward, and silence for 1 minute. Traffic halted. Vendors folded their stalls. A child started to speak, but her mother gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Walter stood apart. No uniform, no badge, just a quiet presence across the street. He leaned against a lamppost and watched as a boy reached out, resting his hand on the bench, whispering something no one else could hear. He had stepped into the harshest places, seen death no more than a hand's length away, heard explosions loud enough to erase every thought. But that 1 minute of silence in the middle of the city weighed on his chest in a different way, deeper and far longer than the first gunshot he ever heard. Not far from the bench, an elderly woman in a gray sweater stood with trembling hands. She placed a white chrysanthemum on the bench rail, then remained still. She didn't leave right away, but pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, dabbed her forehead, and nodded gently, as if whispering to the one who was gone, "I remember, and I still come." Among the crowd were many people Walter had never seen. They weren't locals. Perhaps they came from elsewhere, just passing through. Yet their expressions weren't scattered. Something connected them. Not blood, not shared memory, but a fracture that had once cut through the trust of an entire society. After that minute, the city didn't rush back to the noise. No engines revved, no conversations picked up immediately. Some eyes lingered on the bench a moment longer. Some footsteps moved away, but turned back for one last look. And some sighs slipped out, not from fatigue, but from the weight of a debt slightly lifted to someone they had never known. Walter stood still until the streetlights came on. He didn't cross the road, didn't nod at anyone, but his gaze followed the movements of the crowd, as if memorizing every face, every figure that had chosen to pause, even just for a minute. No one came to ask what he thought or felt, and he didn't need to say it, because in that unnamed silence, Walter understood one thing: he was no longer alone. Not because someone stood beside him with a weapon, but because enough people now knew that justice wasn't an accusation, it was the act of holding still, just long enough, so that no one would unknowingly walk past a pain once forgotten. A plain sheet of paper was pinned to the school library bulletin board, amid flyers about scholarships and sports tryouts. The handwriting was uneven, written in blue ink. "He was the first to help my mom get medicine when no one else would. He waited an hour just to bring her a single pill. My mom doesn't remember his name, but I do." Below that, in bold pencil, Mr. Ezekiel Rowe. No one took it down. The principal even had it laminated during the week that civic ethics became an official subject. Instead of lectures or essays, teachers handed out blank slips and asked, "If you had to name someone who made you believe kindness doesn't need a reason, who would it be?" Most students named family or neighbors, even pets. But some wrote Ezekiel's name, not because they knew him, but from stories passed along. One student said her mom remembered him bringing milk to the clinic without being asked. Another drew a man dropping off groceries, quietly, never ringing the bell. The civics teacher used a class to teach quiet acts, writing "no name needed" on the board and crossing out the first two words. Some people don't need to be remembered by name, but they must be taught, not for politics, but for ethics. A 9th grade class made a wall poster titled, "What if he were your father?" No portraits, just a worn cloth bag, broken eggs, and a blood stain. Underneath, it said, "This isn't a picture, it's a question." The story sparked informal storytelling hours at other schools. No one added Ezekiel's name to textbooks, but they invited locals to share real memories, small, quiet ones that stuck. Walter learned about it from an email with a photo of the bulletin board. The boy stood looking at the note. The principal wrote, "You should know your father is still being taught here." Walter didn't reply. He sat in his kitchen, staring at the photo. His hand rested near a scratch on the table, a mark from sorting his father's things. He tapped once, then touched the screen where the paper note was. The kids hadn't met Ezekiel, but they were learning about him, not from the curriculum, but from adults who finally shared something they owed. If justice must be seen to be believed, ethics often starts with what's unseen, simply remembered when it matters most. Ezekiel's story had moved past news headlines and court verdicts. It became something people recognized in each other, a reminder of the man who waited on that sidewalk. One afternoon, in that same school, a girl stood before her class and said, "They used to call me the wrong name. But each time they did, I thought of someone who doesn't need a name anymore to be remembered." The sentence landed like a small cut, not one that bled, but one that quieted the room. No one asked who she meant. No one asked for clarification. Only silence rose, then spread. A few students lowered their heads, their faces contemplative. The teacher stared at the open lesson plan, but didn't turn the page. Some students looked up again, not at the girl, but at themselves. At the back of the room, one chair sat empty. It had always been a spot for the latecomers or the quiet ones. Today, Walter entered, wearing a simple button-down shirt. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A student near the door recognized him first. The boy didn't stand or call out, just nodded. Walter nodded back. Their eyes met, not as a celebrity to a fan, nor a hero to a crowd, but as two people who understood something too deeply to name. He chose a corner seat and listened to the unfinished lesson. No one interrupted. No one changed their tone to welcome him, but his presence shifted the air, made it heavier, more focused. Words came slower after that, but they held more weight. A girl read from the textbook, her voice steadier than usual. A boy in the back folded his arms on the desk, eyes fixed on the words glowing from the projector. After the bell rang, students filed out. Walter rose last, walking toward the bulletin board in the hallway. The paper slips still clung there, some curled with age. One handwritten note by a girl remained. The slanted line read, "I was called the wrong name, but every time I remembered someone who no longer needed to be called by name." Walter pulled a folded slip from his pocket. It was slightly bent at the corners, with one line, "Thank you for keeping my grandfather's name the right way, not by saying it, but by how you live." He taped it beside hers, securing it with clear tape, and stood there a moment. No one was around. No one snapped a photo or asked him anything, but the hallway felt like it was breathing slower. On his way out, he passed the back courtyard where students were playing basketball. A ball bounced toward him. Walter picked it up and handed it to the boy, who came running, asking softly, "What's your name?" The boy answered. Walter repeated the name, carefully, not missing a syllable. The boy nodded and ran off, but looked back once more. In a world where titles are twisted and people can die for the color of their skin, remembering a name correctly is the fullest act of respect. Walter didn't try to teach that lesson, but he made it clearer than any textbook could. Sometimes, nodding at the right moment and remaining silent in the right place is the strongest way to continue what the dead never had the chance to finish. Walter did not re-enlist. He declined all invitations to speak at conferences or interviews. When asked for a statement, he replied, "I once had a voice, but now I choose to let others speak." He wasn't hiding, just choosing a quieter path. Instead of returning to duty, he quietly walked into a nearby community center, toolbox in hand. The manager assumed he was a repairman, and he was. That first morning, Walter fixed a leaking pipe, knees on the floor, sleeves rolled up. He kept showing up, cleaning windows, helping teens fix their resumes. He never mentioned the trial or his service. When asked why he stayed, he said, "'Cause this is where my father waited for me." Kids called him Uncle Walter in the gray jacket. He answered questions about math and life, but never stood in front of the class. He preferred writing on the board and letting others try. When a boy made a mistake and got teased, Walter told a story about forgetting his language overseas, and everyone laughed, including the boy. Soon, adults came not just for help, but to talk. Walter listened, poured water, and said little. When tears came, he let them. His reply was often simple. "I've had days like that too." The center's walls were filled with drawings. One showed an old man holding a bag of groceries in the sunlight. A child's note read, "Mr. Ezekiel, no one hugged him in time, but everyone wanted to." Walter looked at that picture every morning. He never sought monuments or fame. Instead, he fixed pipes, edited documents, and remembered names. And in doing so, Ezekiel lived on, not through applause, but in every small act Walter carried out with quiet care. Around the neighborhood, people didn't call Walter a hero or a veteran. They simply called him the one who keeps memory alive, the man who walked slowly past the bench each morning, who picked up paper for elders, and who looked at school notice boards as if memory itself lived there. Walter never tried to become a symbol, but his refusal to be the center made him an anchor. A few strangers from other districts stopped by the community center to meet the soldier who stayed silent in court. Some wanted a photo, some wanted to hear him recount the day Mr. Ezekiel was killed. He always smiled, polite but firm. "I don't tell that story here. Here we talk about how to keep living." One afternoon, while he was in the kitchen cooking noodles with a few teenagers, a white boy stared at him and asked directly, "Who are you that people look at you like that?" The question wasn't disrespectful. It was honest curiosity from someone who hadn't seen tragedy but could feel its echo. The room went still. Walter looked up, still stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, and answered in a calm voice, "Just the son of a man who never bowed his head." That answer needed no explanation. It wasn't written on the walls or printed on t-shirts. But after that day, people started mentioning Walter's father more, not as a victim, but as someone who never buckled. The story lived through voices, in quiet conversations during class, or when someone asked, "What's that bench for?" A group of elders proposed renaming the nearby park after Ezekiel. Walter declined. He said, "If you want to honor him, let people tell his story, not with a nameplate, but by living a little more kindly." The proposal was withdrawn, but from that day on, no one littered in that park corner anymore. A few children were told by their parents, "If you sit on that bench, be quiet for a moment." Sometimes, Walter would stand in front of the bathroom mirror at the center, looking at himself, as if to ask, "Am I doing enough?" And then he'd remember Ezekiel, the man who taught him, "No one can hold justice in their hands, but anyone can keep it from fading in the memory of good people." And that, he believed, was enough. Outside the center, the old tree rustled. In the sunlight slipping through its leaves, Walter folded the towel, hung it on the hook, and returned to the activity room, where a kid waited for him to check his first job application. Walter stepped in, pen in hand, saying nothing, but the way he sat, focused, underlining typos like it was a classified document, was exactly why people called him the keeper of living memory. Not because he retold it, but because he lived as if those memories were still unfolding every single day. There was no single name everyone agreed on for Ezekiel Rowe after that day. Each person remembered him differently, and so each gave him a different name. Someone who had once taken part in his volunteer health classes called him Teacher. An elderly nurse said he healed more than doctors ever did. An old man who had played chess with him for years simply said, "He was my friend. That's enough." But even those who never met him found a name. On many forums, the caption beneath his image wasn't a title or formal name. It was a phrase, "The man who waited without fear." It echoed gently like breath, yet stood firm like stone. No flourish, no argument, just truth. The memory didn't stop there. On a wall behind the community center, a charcoal mural slowly emerged. No one commissioned it, no grants, no plaques, just a group of art students who came with chalk, charcoal, and muted paints, drawing quietly. It wasn't a clear portrait, just a silhouette under a streetlight, one hand holding a paper bag, the other hanging as if left for someone. No blood, no weapons, only light and shadow. No signatures marked the mural. Each line was a silent story, each shade a piece of memory. People passing by would stop, On rainy days, the students returned to touch up smudged spots. On sunny days, pedestrians would pause, not for pictures but to bow their heads. No one told them to, but they did it, as if it had always been the right thing to do. One child asked her mother, "Why didn't he sit down?" The mother replied, "Because he knew someone would return." That answer became part of the story, unverified, unchallenged, yet understood. Walter knew about the mural but never showed up during the day. At night, he checked the wall for cracks or fading lines. Once he found a small rock with "Dad" scribbled on it in marker. He wiped it off gently and placed it back. By morning, someone had covered it in clear resin to protect it. Sometimes people who once argued about Ezekiel's title would gather there. They'd share stories. How he once lifted an overturned car or carried an elderly woman across the street. Each tale became a new thread in the mural, one that nobody wished to finish, because to finish it would mean the memory had stopped. On May 5th, the day Ezekiel died, locals wore ash gray. Not for mourning, but to match the mural's hue. No ceremonies, no banners. But when eyes met, people nodded, like lighting an invisible incense stick for the man who stood his ground. And year after year, they still came. Not to retell the tragedy, but to remember that one person's courage can slow a crowd down, help them see better, act kinder, and hold on to quiet bravery just a little longer. The story began on a quiet afternoon when Mr. Ezekiel Rowe stood waiting for his son outside a community center, holding a bag of groceries, his gentle eyes steady amid a rushing crowd. No one knew that moment would become the start of a moral awakening, a shockwave that rippled far beyond that small neighborhood, beyond personal grief, a drunk officer, a gunshot in an instant, and a father's blood on the pavement. These weren't new tragedies in American history, but this time, silence was no longer an option. Walter Rowe, the son who arrived 5 seconds too late, did not come to seek revenge. He didn't scream or fight or make himself the center of the story. He simply held his father, pressed his forehead to the old man's, like a soldier trained to stay calm in battle, and whispered 3 simple words: "Don't forgive." From that moment, Walter was no longer a Special Forces operative. He became the keeper of the story, not to let it be rewritten, not to let the truth be buried in dry reports. The footage spread across platforms. No fast cuts, no background music, no captions. Its silence made viewers hold their breath. The hashtag #HeWasJustWaiting was not a slogan, it was testimony. One look from Walter toward the officer who shot his father said more than any indictment. When the trial began, Walter didn't need a microphone or an argument. He was simply there. Quiet but undeniable. Every citizen, student, and witness saw what no one had taught. Justice doesn't need to shout, it needs to endure. The charcoal portrait, the nameless bench, the handwritten notes in school hallways, the students who remembered Mr. Ezekiel without ever meeting him. These were proof of a different kind of power. A power not drawn from status, titles, or platforms, but from the act of standing still, exactly where one should, without retreating, without yielding to the invisible pressures crushing society day by day. When a young student bent to pick up a fallen grocery bag by the bench, no one needed to teach him what to do. No one told him to place the items back in their original spot or to bow his head, but he did, as if it were a reflex passed down from a generation that had no voice to one learning how to listen. When Walter walked by and his hand brushed the bench's surface, he didn't sit, because he understood that the seat was reserved for those still learning how to stand. Beneath the wooden bench where Ezekiel once fell, the grass has grown green again. There's no nameplate, no protective fence, yet everyone who passes by slows their step. Walter no longer needs to tell the story. It now speaks for itself through glances, actions, and the smallest gestures. And if anyone asks what remains after everything, perhaps only one sentence is needed. We are not allowed to look away when what's wrong is standing right in front of us. And what about you? Have you found justice where you live?